Hi everyone, my name is Kira Tasopoulos and I'm a business student at the University of Washington. Today I will be presenting the research I've conducted on implementing cap and trade versus carbon taxation in Brazil. In the Paris Agreement, Brazil pledged to cut 37% of its carbon emissions by 2025, along with zero deforestation of the Amazon rainforest by 2030. Although this is a manageable goal, Brazil continues to rank as one of the highest emitting countries in the world, along with having a government that publicly expresses opposition to climate change policies. Now that we have this information, I'd like to get started and give you the layout of the rest of my presentation. To start off, my presentation will be divided into four main parts. First, I will look at Brazil's gross domestic product, or GDP. Second, I will analyze the top GDP driving industries and how they play a part in producing carbon emissions. The third portion will be spent looking at the trade-offs between cap and trade and carbon taxation in Brazil, and then finally I will make some concluding remarks and recap key takeaways from my presentation. Alright, time to look at Brazil's GDP to get some insight on the economy and major industries. According to Trading Economics, Brazil's 2019 GDP was worth $1,839.76 billion USD, with some of the main driving industries being agriculture and manufacturing. This was a decrease in GDP for the nation compared to 2018 results, and the nation is projected to continue along this downward trend into 2021. This expected decline in GDP tells us that Brazil will likely spend less time focused on lowering carbon emissions and more on boosting GDP. Considering this information, we will now move into the second part of my presentation. In this part, I will analyze some of the top GDP driving industries and how they produce carbon emissions. The first industry we will take a look at is the agricultural industry. Given that Brazil's topography is home to 65% of the Amazon basin, it only makes sense that agriculture would be a top greenhouse gas and GDP contributor. Looking at the graph to the left, Brazil's deforestation in 2019 increased dramatically by 30% compared to the previous year, and this is mostly due to the clearing of forests to make room for cattle ranching. This is harmful for emissions in three ways. For starters, the cutting and burning of the rainforest releases carbon into the atmosphere. Next, the absence of the tree removes the carbon sink that was once there absorbing CO2 through photosynthesis. Finally, increasing cattle produces methane, which is said to be 23 times more harmful than carbon dioxide. Moving past the agricultural industry, we will now dive into manufacturing. Brazil runs heavily on hydroelectric sources to produce electricity, which is known to have harmful greenhouse gas effects. According to climate change scientist Eric Duchemin, hydroelectric dams produce significant amounts of carbon dioxide and methane, and in some cases produce more of these greenhouse gases than power plants running on fossil fuels. This is seen clearly looking at the Caruaçu Dam in Para, Brazil, which is currently pictured. This dam's greenhouse effect on emissions was 3.5 times more than what would be seen had the electricity been produced using oil instead of the dam. Now that we have information on Brazil's emissions-driving industries, we can evaluate the trade-offs between cap and trade and carbon taxation. First, we'll take a look at cap and trade. Implementing cap and trade will allow Brazil to set specific emission caps that decline over time. Being able to set the exact amount of emissions produced will help the nation get back on track of meeting their Paris Agreement goal by 2025. Cap and trade will also force the manufacturing industry to cut back on emissions. With cap and trade, companies are only allowed to emit a certain amount before being penalized or forced to buy more allowance from others. This motivates large emitting companies to cut emissions to save money, as the declining cap will make costs higher with time. The cap and trade system not only reduces emissions, but it also encourages companies to find innovative ways to lower their carbon footprint. Successful companies are then rewarded as they get to sell their allowances to those who are still polluting more. Keeping all this in mind, we're now going to move into looking at the trade-offs of implementing carbon taxation. For starters, a carbon tax is stable as emitters pay based on how much they produce. The consistency of the tax will allow energy producers and entrepreneurs to invest without the fear of fluctuation in regulatory costs. Carbon taxation can also better target cattle ranchers. Since cows are the #1 agricultural source of greenhouse gases, it seems appropriate to secure taxation on the industry. Taxation laws can be written on a per-cow basis as well, enforce discouraging deforestation to create new cattle land, and will punish cattle ranchers even further for their extra emissions. Lastly, a carbon tax requires minimal involvement from the government. This is ideal for Brazil, given the government has not only rolled back enforcement of environmental protections, but has even rejected aid from other nations to reforest the Amazon. Implementing a transparent tax that simply needs to be set and held would be a policy far more probable of happening. Based on the information we have gathered thus far, it is clear both the cap and trade and carbon taxation systems have the potential of helping Brazil lower their carbon emissions. Lastly, we will do a brief recap on the benefits of both taxation systems. Looking at cap and trade, this system will help Brazil meet its Paris Agreement pledge, along with encourage the production of new technology to lower emissions from manufacturing companies. Carbon taxation, on the other hand, provides certainty on the costs of compliance without fear of fluctuation, along with minimal government involvement needed. This system can also better target the agricultural industry as well. Given the nation's weak climate initiatives, focus on GDP, and emissions-boosting industries, it is clear a lot comes into play when considering which taxation system to implement in Brazil. Thank you for your time. I appreciate you attending my presentation and hope you enjoyed. Thank you.